It all started with a letter that arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning. The envelope was plain, nothing special about it, but something inside me tensed the moment I saw it. Maybe it was the way it had been slipped under our door, as if whoever delivered it didn't want to be seen. Or maybe it was just instinct, some deep-down feeling telling me this wasn't going to be good news. James was in the kitchen making coffee when I opened it. "What's that?" he asked casually, not looking up from his mug. "Just some survey notice," I replied, trying to sound calm even though my hands were trembling slightly. "They're checking property lines before we expand the garden." He nodded, uninterested. To him, it was just another boring piece of paperwork. But for me, it felt heavier, like it carried secrets I wasn't ready to uncover. A week later, the surveyor showed up at our door. He was a tall man with glasses perched on the edge of his nose and a clipboard tucked under his arm. At first glance, he seemed friendly enough, but there was something off about him, a nervous energy that made me uneasy. "Mrs. Harper?" he asked, glancing at his notes. "I'm here to review the results of your property survey." "Sure," I said, stepping aside to let him in. "Everything okay?" His hesitation told me everything I needed to know. Instead of answering right away, he spread out a large map on our dining table and pointed to a thin red line. "This is where your property ends," he explained. Then he moved his finger slightly to the left. "And this is where your neighbor's house begins." My stomach dropped. According to the map, part of Margaret Hargrove's massive mansion, the one she bragged about during last year's block party, was built on our asterisk land. Not just a tiny sliver either. Nearly 10 feet of her front yard, including a chunk of her driveway and garage, belonged to us. "How is this possible?" I stammered, staring at the map like it might change if I looked hard enough. "We've lived here for 5 years. No one ever mentioned this before." The surveyor shrugged uncomfortably. "These things happen sometimes. Old records can get mixed up, especially in older neighborhoods like this one." Old records. Mixed up. It sounded too convenient. And knowing Margaret, nothing about this situation would be simple. She was the type of person who thrived on control, always sticking her nose into other people's business. As president of the HOA, she treated Maplewood Lane like her personal kingdom, enforcing rules no one cared about and handing out fines like candy. I glanced out the window at her house. It loomed over the cul-de-sac, bigger and flashier than any of the others. White columns framed the entrance, and perfectly trimmed hedges lined the walkway. Everything about it screamed wealth and power, including its owner. She knew. I muttered under my breath. She had to have known. James walked over, curious now. When I showed him the map, his eyes widened. "Wow. That's awkward." Awkward didn't begin to cover it. This wasn't just a minor mistake. It was a deliberate act. Margaret had built her dream house on someone else's land. And not just anyone. Me. For the rest of the day, I couldn't focus. Every time I looked at her house, I felt a mix of anger and disbelief. How could she do this? And more importantly, what was I supposed to do about it? That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I realized something. Margaret thought she could push people around because no one stood up to her. But this time, she'd gone too far. Whatever it took, I was going to make sure she paid for what she'd done. The next morning, I woke up with a plan forming in my mind. It wasn't fully fleshed out yet, but one thing was clear. I couldn't let this slide. Margaret Hargrove had taken something that didn't belong to her, and she needed to know I wasn't going to sit back and do nothing. James, on the other hand, was already trying to talk me down. "Look," he said over breakfast, his voice calm but firm. "I get it. This is frustrating. But you can't just storm over there accusing her of stealing your land. That's extreme." "Extreme?" I shot back, slamming my coffee mug onto the table harder than I intended. "She built half her house on our property. What exactly am I supposed to do? Thank her?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. All I'm saying is, maybe we should handle this carefully. Talk to her first, see what she says. If things escalate, then we can figure out the next steps." Reluctantly, I agreed. Deep down, I knew James had a point. Charging into battle without thinking could make things worse. So after breakfast, I marched across the street, clutching the survey map like evidence in a courtroom drama. My heart pounded as I approached Margaret's front door. For all her perfectly manicured hedges and pristine white columns, her house suddenly felt intimidating, like some fortress protecting its queen. When she opened the door, her smile was polite but distant, the kind she reserved for people she considered beneath her. "Oh, hello, dear," she said sweetly, though her eyes narrowed ever so slightly when she saw me. "What brings you here?" "I think you know why I'm here," I replied, skipping the pleasantries. I held up the survey map and pointed to the red line marking the property boundary. "This shows that part of your house and your driveway is actually on my land." Her smile faltered for a split second, but she recovered quickly. "Oh, that old thing," she said dismissively, waving a hand as if swatting away an annoying fly. "You must be mistaken. My architect double-checked everything before construction started. There's no way this is accurate." "No way," I repeated, incredulous. "Are you seriously telling me this survey is wrong? Because according to these records, nearly 10 feet of your property belongs to me." Margaret crossed her arms, her expression hardening. The sugar-sweet tone disappeared, replaced by something colder. "Listen, Mrs. Harper," she said sharply, "if you're looking to cause trouble, you're wasting your time. I've lived here for years, and no one has ever questioned the boundaries until now. Why don't you focus on your own problems instead of trying to stir up drama?" Her words hit like a slap, but I refused to back down. "This isn't about drama," I said firmly. "It's about facts. And unless you can prove otherwise, those facts say you're trespassing on my property." For a moment, Margaret looked genuinely rattled. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and her cheeks flushed pink. Then, just as quickly, her mask of superiority snapped back into place. "Fine," she said curtly. "Do whatever you need to do. But trust me, you won't win this fight." With that, she shut the door in my face, leaving me standing there seething. The nerve of her. She acted like she was untouchable, like the rules didn't apply to her because she wore designer clothes and chaired the HOA meetings. But I wasn't going to let her bully me into silence. As I walked back home, my mind raced. Margaret clearly wasn't going to admit fault or offer any kind of solution. If anything, she'd probably dig in her heels even harder. And knowing her, she wouldn't hesitate to use her influence to make life difficult for me and James. But I wasn't afraid of her games. In fact, her arrogance only fueled my determination. Whatever it took, I was going to set things right, even if it meant playing dirty. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with James, poring over every document related to our property. Titles, deeds, surveys. We went through them all, searching for anything that could strengthen our case. It was tedious work, but each piece of evidence felt like another weapon in my arsenal. "You really think this is worth it?" James asked eventually, rubbing his temples. "Going up against someone like Margaret, it's not going to be easy." "It's not about being easy," I replied, my voice steady. "It's about doing what's right. She stole from us, James. We can't just ignore that." He nodded slowly, though I could tell he still had doubts. But I didn't care. Margaret might have thought she was untouchable, but she hadn't met anyone willing to stand up to her before. Little did she know, I was just getting started. By the next morning, I knew I couldn't fight this battle alone. Margaret was too powerful, too connected, and too used to getting her way. If I wanted to stand a chance, I needed help, and not just from James. I needed someone who understood the law, who could guide me through the mess of property lines, deeds, and easements. So I called an old friend from college named Rachel. She wasn't just any friend. She was a real estate lawyer with a reputation for being sharp as a tack. When I explained the situation over the phone, She didn't laugh or tell me I was overreacting like I'd half expected. Instead, she listened carefully, asking questions that made me think harder about the details. "This is serious," she said after a pause. "If the survey is accurate, you've got a strong case. But Margaret isn't going to back down without a fight. She'll try to intimidate you, maybe even lean on the HOA to make your life difficult." "Great," I muttered, sinking into my chair. Just what I needed to hear. "But here's the thing," Rachel continued, her tone firm. "You can't let her push you around. The key is finding leverage, something that gives you the upper hand, something she can't ignore." Leverage. The word stuck in my head long after we hung up. What did I have that Margaret cared about? Money? Probably not. She had more than enough of that. Reputation? Maybe, but she seemed too stubborn to care what others thought. Then it hit me, a memory from when we first moved into Maplewood Lane. During one of those awkward neighborhood welcome meetings, someone mentioned how the electricity supply to Margaret's house ran through a utility easement owned by the power company. At the time, it hadn't meant anything to me. But now, I grabbed my laptop and started digging. Sure enough, the utility easement rights were listed in public records, and they were available for purchase. My heart raced as I scrolled through the information. If I bought those rights, I'd essentially control access to the power lines running under her property. Without them, her dream mansion would be nothing more than a very expensive, very dark shell. It felt almost too good to be true. Could I really pull this off? The idea of cutting off Margaret's electricity sent a thrill through me, but I also knew it was risky. Turning off someone's power wasn't exactly subtle, and it might make me look like the villain in all of this. Still, desperation pushed me forward. This wasn't just about winning. It was about making her understand that no one messed with me and got away with it. The next day, I called the utility company. After explaining my interest in purchasing the easement rights, they sent over the paperwork. It wasn't cheap, but I didn't care. Every dollar felt like an investment in justice. By the end of the week, the deal was done. I owned the easement. When I told James what I'd done, he stared at me like I'd lost my mind. "Are you serious?" he asked, his voice rising. "You actually bought her electricity rights. What happens if she finds out?" "She'll find out soon enough," I replied, unable to hide my grin. "And when she does, she'll know exactly who she's dealing with." That night, I sat on the couch staring at the ceiling, imagining Margaret's reaction when the lights went out. Would she panic? Call the utility company? Blame her staff? Part of me felt guilty for stooping to such tactics, but another part, the angrier, more determined part, felt alive in a way I hadn't in years. For once, I wasn't backing down. I wasn't letting someone else dictate the rules. Tomorrow, I decided, I'd flip the switch, and then we'd see who really held the power in Maplewood Lane. The day I flipped the switch, my hands trembled, not from fear, but from a mix of excitement and nerves. This wasn't just about cutting off Margaret's electricity. It was about sending her a message loud and clear. No one takes what's mine without consequences. I waited until late afternoon when the neighborhood was quiet. Most people were either at work or busy with their routines, which meant fewer prying eyes. James had already left for the office earlier that morning, shaking his head as he walked out the door. "This is crazy," he muttered under his breath before driving away. But I didn't need his approval. Not this time. With the paperwork in hand, I headed over to the utility box near the edge of my property, the one that controlled the power supply to Margaret's house. It was tucked behind a row of bushes, almost hidden from view. Whoever installed it clearly hadn't expected anyone to pay much attention to it. That worked in my favor. As I opened the panel, my heart pounded so loudly I was sure the neighbors could hear it. Inside, there were several switches labeled with addresses. I found the one marked for Margaret's house and hesitated for just a moment. Was I really about to do this? Yes, I told myself firmly. She stole from me first. If she wanted to play dirty, then fine. I'd show her exactly how dirty things could get. I flipped the switch. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then, from across the street, I heard the faint hum of silence. The air conditioning unit on the side of Margaret's house stopped humming. Her fountain, which usually bubbled cheerfully in the front yard, went still. Even the automatic lights lining her driveway flickered and died. A rush of satisfaction washed over me. It worked. I stayed hidden behind the bushes, watching as Margaret stormed outside a few minutes later. At first, she looked confused, glancing around like she thought maybe a storm had knocked out the power. But when she realized none of the other houses on the street were affected, her confusion turned into anger. She marched straight to her utility box, fiddling with it frantically, even though she clearly had no idea what she was doing. "This has to be a mistake," she shouted to no one in particular, throwing her hands up in frustration. "How does this even happen?" Her voice carried across the cul-de-sac, drawing curious stares from a couple of neighbors who peeked out their windows. I bit my lip to keep from laughing. "Oh, Margaret, you have no idea," I thought smugly. By evening, she was practically livid. I watched from my porch as she paced back and forth in front of her house, muttering to herself. She tried calling the utility company repeatedly, pacing faster each time they put her on hold. Eventually, she gave up and disappeared inside, slamming the door behind her. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop replaying the scene in my mind. Seeing Margaret flustered, no, humiliated, was more satisfying than I'd imagined. For years, she'd acted like she owned Maplewood Lane, enforcing ridiculous rules and treating everyone else like servants. Now, for the first time, she was powerless. Literally. But deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. Cutting off her electricity might have rattled her, but it wouldn't be enough to make her give up the land she'd stolen. No, she'd fight back. And when she did, I needed to be ready. The next morning, I woke up feeling both triumphant and uneasy. What if she figured out it was me? Would she retaliate? Maybe call the police or file some kind of complaint. The thought sent a shiver down my spine, but I pushed it aside. Let her try. I'd already proven I wasn't afraid to play hardball. Margaret Hargrove had always thrived on control. But now, thanks to me, her perfect little world was starting to crack, and I couldn't wait to see how far those cracks would spread. By the second day without electricity, Margaret was unraveling, and it was glorious. I watched from my kitchen window as she paced furiously in her driveway, clutching her phone like it was a lifeline. She'd spent hours on hold with the utility company, only to be told there was no reported outage in the area. Her fountain still sat dry and stagnant, its once pristine surface now covered in a thin layer of grime. Even her precious air conditioning had given up, leaving her massive house sweltering in the summer heat. But what really caught my attention was the way she looked. Disheveled, frantic, and completely unlike the polished queen bee everyone knew. Gone were the perfectly styled hair and crisp outfits. Instead, she wore an oversized sun hat and sunglasses, sweat beading on her forehead despite the shade. It was almost poetic, seeing her so undone. Still, I wasn't naive enough to think she'd roll over just because her lights were out. Margaret didn't get to where she was by backing down easily. If anything, this would make her more dangerous. Sure enough, late that afternoon, I saw her car pull out of the driveway and speed off toward the HOA clubhouse. I couldn't help but wonder what she was planning. Was she rallying her cronies against me, trying to dig up dirt to use as leverage? Whatever it was, I knew I needed to stay one step ahead. The next morning, I found out exactly how far she was willing to go. As I watered the plants in my front yard, a police cruiser slowly rolled down the street and parked in front of my house. My stomach dropped as two officers stepped out, their expressions unreadable. Neighbors peeked through their curtains, no doubt eager to see what kind of drama was unfolding this time. "Mrs. Harper," one of them asked, approaching me cautiously. He held up a clipboard. "We've received reports of trespassing and vandalism involving your neighbor's property." My heart skipped a beat. Vandalism. Trespassing. What was she accusing me of now? "I'm sorry," I said, forcing myself to sound calm. I don't know what you're talking about. The officer glanced at his notes. According to Ms. Hargrove, someone has tampered with her electricity supply. She believes it may have been intentional and suspects you might be involved. I stared at him, incredulous. Of course she'd blame me. But could she prove it? I hadn't left any evidence behind, or at least I didn't think I had. Still, the accusation stung. Margaret wasn't just fighting dirty. She was dragging the authorities into our feud. I understand why she'd think that, I replied carefully, but I haven't touched her property. Not since I discovered part of it is actually mine. The officer raised an eyebrow. Clearly, he hadn't heard about the survey yet. So I explained everything. The boundary dispute, the stolen land, even the easement rights I'd purchased. I showed him copies of the documents, watching his expression shift from suspicion to something closer to understanding. "We'll look into this," he said finally, tucking the papers back into his folder. "But in the meantime, try not to escalate things further. Legal disputes can take time to resolve." When they left, I felt a mix of relief and frustration. Relief that they hadn't arrested me on the spot, but frustration that Margaret was using her influence to paint me as the bad guy. That night, I called Rachel again, updating her on everything that had happened. "She's desperate," Rachel said after listening quietly. "Dragging the cops into this shows she's running out of options. But you need to be careful. Accusations like that can stick if you're not prepared." "I know," I admitted, pacing the living room. "But I can't let her win. Not after everything." Rachel sighed. "Then we play smart. Keep your cool, document everything, and don't give her any ammunition. Let her mistakes work against her." Her advice stuck with me long after we hung up. Margaret might have thought she could scare me into submission, but she underestimated one thing. I wasn't afraid of her anymore. Every move she made only fueled my determination to see this through, to reclaim what was rightfully mine and teach her a lesson she wouldn't forget. And as I sat on my porch that evening, staring at her darkened house, I realized something important. Margaret's perfect world wasn't just cracking, it was crumbling. And I was holding the hammer. By the third day without electricity, Margaret's facade had completely crumbled. The once unshakable ruler of Maplewood Lane was now a shadow of herself. Frustrated, disheveled, and desperate. I could see it in the way she moved, her usual confident stride replaced by frantic pacing. She spent most of her time outside, glaring at her utility box like it held all the answers to her problems. But no matter how many times she called the power company or inspected the lines, nothing changed. Her house remained dark, her fountain silent, and her air conditioning useless. It wasn't just Margaret who was feeling the strain. The neighborhood buzzed with whispers about the outage. Some people sided with her, calling me petty for taking things too far. Others quietly cheered me on, tired of living under her thumb. One neighbor even stopped me while I was checking the mail to say, "Good for you, sticking up for yourself." That woman needed someone to put her in her place. Still, not everyone was happy. A few houses down, an elderly couple complained about the tension, saying they didn't want drama ruining the peace of the cul-de-sac. It made me feel guilty for a moment. After all, this feud wasn't just affecting Margaret and me. But then I reminded myself why I was doing this. She'd stolen my land, acted like she was untouchable, and tried to bully me into submission. If anyone deserved to face consequences, it was her. That evening, as I watered the flowers in my front yard, I saw Margaret step out of her house again. This time, though, something was different. Instead of storming toward her utility box or shouting into her phone, she walked straight to my porch. Her steps were slow, deliberate, almost hesitant. For a moment, I thought she might actually apologize, or at least admit what she'd done. But when she reached the bottom of my steps, her expression hardened. "We need to talk," she said sharply, her voice cutting through the quiet evening air. "About what?" I asked, leaning casually against the railing. I didn't invite her up. Let her stand there if she wanted to speak. "This nonsense has gone on long enough," she snapped, gesturing vaguely toward her darkened house. You know exactly what's happening here, and you're going to fix it right now. I raised an eyebrow, feigning innocence. Fix what? I already told you. I haven't touched your property. Don't play dumb with me, she hissed, her composure slipping. You bought those easement rights, didn't you? You cut off my electricity. For a second, I considered denying it, but something about the raw anger in her voice made me change my mind. And if I did, I replied coolly, what are you going to do about it? She stared at me, stunned. Clearly, she hadn't expected me to admit it so openly. When she finally spoke, her tone was icy. You think this is funny? Ruining my life over some stupid property line. Do you have any idea how much trouble you're causing? Actually, I said, stepping closer to the edge of the porch, I think you're the one causing trouble. You built part of your house on my land, Margaret. My land. And instead of admitting it and fixing the problem, you've spent days accusing me of vandalism and dragging the police into this mess. So don't act like you're the victim here. Her face flushed red, but she didn't argue. For the first time since this whole thing started, she looked defeated. After a long pause, she sighed heavily. Fine, she muttered, looking away. You win. Just turn the power back on, and we'll settle this properly. Part of me wanted to press harder, to make her grovel or beg, but I knew better than to push too far. Sometimes, winning isn't about rubbing it in. It's about knowing when to stop. We'll settle it legally, I said firmly. Transfer the land rights to me, plus compensation for legal fees, and I'll restore your electricity. She hesitated, clearly reluctant, but eventually nodded. Deal, she said through gritted teeth. As she trudged back to her house, I felt a surge of satisfaction. Not because I'd crushed her, but because I'd stood my ground. Margaret Hargrove had finally met her match and learned that no one, not even her, was above the rules. The next morning, everything felt different. The tension that had hung over Maplewood Lane for days finally began to lift. Margaret kept her word. Sort of. By noon, a stack of legal papers arrived at my door, neatly bound and signed. She officially transferred ownership of the disputed land back to me, along with a modest check to cover legal expenses. It wasn't an apology by any means, but it was enough. Justice, in its own quiet way, had been served. As soon as the documents were in my hands, I headed over to the utility box and flipped the switch. Within moments, life returned to Margaret's house. Her air conditioning hummed back to life. The fountain bubbled cheerfully again, and the automatic lights lining her driveway flickered on as dusk fell. From my porch, I watched her standing in her yard, staring up at the glowing windows like they were some kind of miracle. For once, she didn't look angry or superior, just relieved. But relief wasn't the only emotion swirling around the neighborhood. Word spread quickly about what had happened between Margaret and me. Some neighbors congratulated me openly, calling me brave for standing up to her. Others whispered behind closed doors, unsure whether to admire or criticize my tactics. Even James, who'd been skeptical from the start, admitted he was proud of how I'd handled things. You really did it, he said one evening as we sat on the porch watching the sunset. I mean, I still think cutting off her electricity was extreme. But you stood your ground. No one else would have dared to challenge her like that. I smiled, leaning back in my chair. Sometimes, people like Margaret need to be reminded that they're not untouchable. If no one pushes back, they just keep taking and taking. He nodded thoughtfully. Still, I hope this doesn't come back to bite us later. It won't, I assured him. She knows better now. Trust me, she won't mess with us, or anyone else, again anytime soon. And she didn't. Over the following weeks, Margaret became noticeably quieter. She stopped hosting her usual HOA meetings and avoided most interactions with the neighbors altogether. Eventually, she resigned as president, citing personal reasons. Rumors circulated that she was planning to sell the house and move elsewhere, though nothing was confirmed. Either way, her reign as Queen of Maplewood Lane was officially over. Life in the cul-de-sac slowly returned to normal, or as normal as it could be after such a dramatic showdown. Neighbors who had once tiptoed around Margaret started speaking up more, sharing their own frustrations about her rules and fines. A few even joked about forming their own anti-HOA alliance to prevent anyone else from abusing their power. While I doubted anything formal would come of it, the shift in attitude was undeniable. People felt empowered, less afraid to stand up for themselves. For me, the experience was transformative. Before all this, I'd always been the quiet one, the person who stayed out of conflicts and avoided rocking the boat. But confronting Margaret taught me something important. Sometimes, staying silent isn't strength, it's surrender. Standing up for myself hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. Not just because I got my land back, but because I proved to myself that I was capable of fighting for what was right. One evening, as I walked through the garden, James, and I had finally expanded, I paused to admire the new flower beds blooming under the setting sun. They were vibrant and colorful, a stark contrast to the sterile perfection of Margaret's manicured hedges. In that moment, I realized something. Imperfection has its own kind of beauty. Life isn't meant to be controlled or micromanaged. It's messy, unpredictable, and full of surprises. And maybe, just maybe, that's exactly how it should be. Margaret may have tried to steal my land, but in the end, she gave me something far more valuable: the courage to fight for myself. And as I stood there, surrounded by flowers and the soft hum of summer cicadas, I knew one thing for certain: I'd never let anyone take that away from me again.